You know, I talk to some of the people that I'm communicating with on a regular basis. I've talked to them about this quite regularly. I thought about running in the last Liberal leadership race. Then I thought about running in the last Conservative leadership race. And then I thought about running when all this fell apart, you know, provincially, because I think Kathleen Wynne is an utter disaster. I think she's the most dangerous woman in Canada. And the Conservatives are in terrible disarray. But, you know, I thought it through. I thought, look, well, let's just take the situation with the power grid in Ontario. It's a mess. All right, so if I felt that I would be able to do something credible about that, let's say, that would probably be 6 months worth of 16-hour-a-day study, non-stop, just to understand it. It's like, I'm not prepared. You know, it's a hard job. If you take it as a job, if you're serious about this, you have to understand it. And like the hydro grid is just one small corner of the complexity of Ontario, let's say. I thought, well, I could throw my hat in the ring and it would make for an interesting political, it would make for interesting politics. But then I could win and then I could fail. And that seemed like a really stupid strategy. And then I'd also have to stop doing everything else I'm doing. And that doesn't seem advisable at the moment. You know, because I think, I've thought about politics my whole life, ever since I was 14, even younger than that. And I've always made the same decision, which was to work at the psychological level, essentially, rather than at the political level. I think it's, for me, it's the right level.
I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on Justin Trudeau, your current Prime Minister, and your government in general.
I think he's appalling. Well, I think our Prime Minister is exactly what you would have been afraid of had you been properly afraid when he first put himself out on the scene. So this is, when Justin Trudeau ran for office, I thought, I don't have any respect for what you're doing, because you wouldn't be doing this if your father wasn't the most famous Prime Minister in Canada in the last 50 years. So you have a family name, Trudeau. And you're capitalizing on that. And that's, I would say, well, that shouldn't disqualify you from political office, but you should have earned your name before you dared to throw your hat in the ring. And there's no evidence whatsoever that he had earned his name. And there's certainly no evidence now. So I thought, well, I'm very suspicious of your character, because you should have thought very long and hard about daring to run for political office on the strength of your name alone. It's a narcissistic and juvenile thing to do, but he did it. And then I thought, okay, well, it was time for a new government in Canada. It was time for a change. And despite the fact that it was an error in judgment to run in that manner, maybe you'll be credible. But then the first thing he did, and there was no excuse for this, and it set the tone for everything else that has happened, is he formulated his cabinet and he made it 50% women, despite the fact that only 26% of the elected representatives were women. And when pressed on that, he said, well, because it's 2015, which is a facile answer. His responsibility was to go through his members of parliament and to pick the most qualified people to do the hard work necessary to do a characterological and skills analysis of every single one of those people, and pick the best people, regardless of their race, creed, color, or sex, period. And he didn't do that, and Canadians gave him a free pass. And that was a very bad idea, because, well, first of all, because it was an abdication of responsibility. Second, because it was kowtowing to an ideological position. And third, because he stacked his cabinet with people who were ideologues who weren't qualified. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. The last budget, for example, the whole budget, the main theme of the budget is to address the inequitable situation between men and women, which doesn't even exist. So he's twisted the whole budget to solve a fictional problem with an ideological strategy.
It sounds very similar to what's going on here, where it's all about kind of targeted demographics and putting people in a position because they're women or because they're black, not because they're competent in that necessary position. And this has real-world consequences for many people in South Africa. The last 9 years have been anything but sterling for the average South African, and particularly bad for the poor. Are you very optimistic about South Africa and what kind of a future we have?
I'm very pessimistic about your country. I think you guys are in for an absolute catastrophe over the next 10 years. I hate to say that, but this last bit of legislation with regards to the farmers' lands, that's really, really, really not good.
What do you think of the stories you've read about South Africa in the news in the last little while? It seems that we've cracked the nod in some quite important foreign papers when it comes to this discussion about expropriation of property without compensation.
Well, I was absolutely heartbroken, I would say, when I read the news from South Africa this week. I think it's politically expedient to do what your government is doing. I think it appeals to the worst in everyone. I understand that South Africa has extremely serious social problems and that inequality in South Africa is very, very high. And it's not obvious at all what to do about that. And it's clear that it's suboptimal. But to demolish the rule of law as a precursor to solving that problem only means that it's going to get way, way, way worse before it gets better. I mean, isn't it reasonable to think of Zimbabwe as an example? Is that an unreasonable comparison?
Well, Venezuela. I mean, the same people who would implement stupid, proven policies of destruction in South Africa would probably want to use Venezuela as an example, even though it's a lamentable, demonstrable failure in every which way. It doesn't seem that there's any ability to learn the lessons of history among leaders who are hell-bent on enforcing their ideology on the populace.
Well, I think it's a catastrophe, and I can't see how South Africans can be sleeping easily in their beds these days. So,
first off, Dr. Peterson, you put together this book after hearing from the people that talked to you after attending your lectures, right?
Yes, well, and before that as well. I've been writing it for about 5 years.
So the whole idea of 12 rules for life is what?
Well, people need guidelines in their life, and what I've done is to try to write a sequence of rules that are witty and sometimes obvious as well, I suppose, but to try to go deep down inside of them and to find out why it is that we need principles to live by, and also to point out that we do in fact need principles to live by to guide us towards a meaningful and productive life, and one that helps us deal with the tragedy and malevolence of existence.
Well, we'll all have to go pick that book up. Congratulations on it, making it to #1. You've been on our show quite a few times, and you are just so smart. So I think your advice is something that other people need to pick up and read through the pages. Thank you so much for also weighing in on some other topics affecting your area, Canada. You're in Toronto right now, and Justin Trudeau, he interrupts a woman at a town hall. She's asking him a question, and he didn't like one of the words that she used. Listen to this soundbite, and then we'll get your reaction.
All right.
So that's why we came here today to ask you to also look into the policies that religious charitable organizations have in our legislation so that it can also be changed, because maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look
we like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly.
And the crowd roars.
Yeah. Well, it's quite the performance. I mean, I'm afraid that our Prime Minister is only capable of running his ideas on a few very narrow ideological tracks. We saw the first evidence of that when he put his cabinet together. He insisted upon making it 50% women, despite the fact that only about 22% of the elected MPs were women. And it was easier for him to do that than it was for him to screen people for the sort of competence that would actually be necessary to be cabinet members. So we've seen a fair bit of this behavior, but that was the most egregious example, I suppose.
Dr. Peterson, I recall you taking some heat because you said you would refuse to use these gender-neutral pronouns. Why was that?
Well, I actually said that I would refuse to use the pronouns that were mandated by law because they were mandated by law. I feel that it's completely inappropriate of the government to decide what language the citizenry should speak. There's never been an example of that in British common law history, and I believe that that was a very, very bad precedent. I didn't want to use language that I thought was generated by radical leftist propagandists, and so I said I wouldn't do it.
I saw one tweet this morning that said Neil Armstrong should have said one small step for peoplekind.
Yeah, well, you know, Trudeau was listening to an earnest woman try to discuss something important, and he interjected a ideological statement in the middle of the dialogue, and that indicates, I think, precisely the way he thinks. And I don't think he does think. I think he runs an ideology in his head and accepts the output without question. And I think we're really going to pay for it in Canada in ways that we can't yet imagine.
Well, we're going to find out because you believe it's coming to us here in America, and you've been to both countries frequently. Now let's talk about something else that builds on your premise. This whole father-daughter dance that are being canceled around the country because of gender guidelines. Even Donald Trump Jr. weighed in with this quote: the father-daughter dances inherently leave people out, not just because of transgender status, just life in general. These can be really uncomfortable, triggering events. That, according to Jared Fox, the New York City Department of Education. So that's their response, to cancel the dance because there's a lot of people that can't go. Is there a problem with that?
Well, the problem with that is self-evident, but it's part of this absolute onslaught by the radical leftists on the fundamental normative structures of our culture. And if you're going to cancel everything that's triggering to everyone, then you're going to cancel everything altogether, because there isn't a single thing that anyone can ever say or do that isn't going to offend someone. And the idea that this is being done so that certain people's feelings won't be hurt, I think, is absolutely absurd. It's not compassion and care that's driving this. It's the desire to put forward a very pernicious ideology, and it's being very, very successful in its application.
But, Dr. Peterson, they say that they're doing that to make things more inclusive.
Yeah, well, they say all sorts of things, and they are a very small, noisy, dangerous minority. And it's really appalling that we're bending over backwards to do their bidding without question, under the name of compassion.
A lot of my friends have been posting pictures of the daddy-daughter dance recently, and I think the pictures are so cute. Are little girls going to miss out on a memory?
Well, yes, for sure. And the thing is that even your terminology, when you're talking about little girls, is something that's going to be increasingly forbidden as we demolish the classic gender ideas. And no one's going to benefit from that. And it's going to be a real catastrophe.
I mean, people are even talking about deciding on what gender they want to be as youngsters.
Yeah, well, that's happening all over. It's an absolute epidemic. And we've decided that children as young as 3 or 4 can now decide what gender they are and then undergo the appropriate surgical and biological alterations to bring their morphology in keeping with that. And it's a mistake of epic proportions, and we're going to pay for it in a big way.
We do hear of that, but how often does that happen?
It happens increasingly. Like in Britain in 2015, there were, I think, 57 kids in the gender dysphoria clinics, and last year there were 2,000.
All right. He's got a great book out there, great number-wise right now. #1 in Amazon. It's called 12 Rules for Life. Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you very much for joining us today from Canada.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
Yeah, and thanks for wearing the gel. Looks good.